Imagine a world where the sun goes down and everything just stops. The streetlights don't come on. The bright signs in shop windows stay dark. Your own home becomes a black box, sealed against the night. This wasn't a power failure, it was a rule, a law. For millions of people across Europe, from about 1939 to 1945, darkness was a mandatory state of being. Why would an entire continent turn off its lights? Because up above, bombers were flying. They navigated by sight, following rivers, coastlines, and the telltale glow of a city. Taking away the light was like taking away the map. It was a desperate collective act of hiding. But living in that darkness wasn't simple. It came with a whole new set of rules, a new way of life dictated by the absence of light. It changed how people walked, drove, worked, and even how they felt. What did it really mean to live in a world where a single lit candle could be seen as a betrayal? How did society function when the simple act of looking out your window at night was forbidden? Number 19, why did a single chink of light mean danger? The first and most important rule of the blackout was absolute. No light could escape your home. Not from a window, not from a door, not even from a tiny crack in the wall. This wasn't a suggestion. It was an order enforced with the full weight of the law. The logic was simple and terrifying. Enemy aircraft flew miles high in the sky. Their navigators weren't using advanced systems. They were using their eyes, looking for landmarks. A single street, lit up by its house windows, could be a perfect line pointing the way to a factory or a dockyard. A whole town, glowing faintly, was a target. Even one solitary light, a single chink in the armor of darkness, could be enough. It could be the reference point a bombardier needed to confirm their position. Your home, your little lamp, could be the beacon that guided destruction. So people had to make their homes light-proof. This was a huge task. The British government, for instance, issued instructions to the Ministry of Home Security. Full pamphlets were printed and distributed. They told you exactly what to do. You needed to get blackout material. This was usually a thick black cotton fabric. You had to buy it, and for many it was an unexpected expense right at the start of a long and difficult period. If you couldn't afford the special cloth, you had to improvise. People used blankets, thick cardboard, plywood, or anything they could find to make their windows opaque. Some even painted their window panes with thick black paint. Imagine doing that, permanently blocking the daylight from your home just to make sure you were safe at night. The process was meticulous. You couldn't just hang a curtain. It had to be sealed. Light could escape around the edges. So people built wooden frames around their windows to tack the fabric onto. They used tape and drawing pins. They stuffed rags into any gaps. The goal was to create a light-tight seal. Before you could even think about turning on a lamp in the evening, you had to go through the ritual of blacking out. You'd go from window to window, securing the coverings, making sure everything was perfect. Families would often have one person double-check the work of another. Children were taught how important it was. The fear of showing a light was drilled into everyone. This had a profound effect on life inside the home. Homes became stuffy and claustrophobic, with windows sealed shut. Ventilation was terrible, especially in summer. The air grew stale. The sense of being cooped up, of being trapped inside a dark box, was a constant psychological pressure. This was documented in the Mass Observation Archive, a project started in the UK in 1937 to record everyday life. The diaries and reports from ordinary people are filled with complaints about the stuffiness, the smell, and the gloom of their blacked out homes. You know, it was a small daily sacrifice for the greater good, but it wore people down. You know, the very place that was meant to be a sanctuary felt like a prison. And the danger of a mistake was always present. A curtain could slip. A child could accidentally open a door to the outside while a light was on. The consequences were immediate. A neighbor might shout. Or worse, you'd hear the sharp rap on the door and the stern voice of the air raid precautions, or ARP warden. They were the civilian volunteers tasked with enforcing the blackout, and they did not take their jobs lightly. What do we still not know about this? We know people complained, but what was the true unrecorded psychological cost of living in sealed, dark boxes for nearly 6 years? Did rates of domestic conflict or depression rise in direct proportion to the lack of fresh air and light? And if so, how was this hidden from official records? How many times did a single accidental chink of light actually lead to a targeted attack? And is it even possible to trace such a direct line of cause and effect? In number 18, how did you drive a car with almost no light? Driving a car is already a complex task. Now, imagine doing it when you can barely see a few feet in front of you. That was the reality under the blackout rules. You couldn't just turn your headlights off. That would be impossible. But you couldn't use them normally either. A pair of bright headlights moving, along a road would be a dead giveaway to an aircraft, a moving arrow pointing along a transport route. So a compromise was made, one that was incredibly dangerous. The rule was that all vehicle headlights had to be masked. Governments produced official designs for these masks. In Britain, for example, the regulation specified a metal disc that covered the headlamp. It had 3 narrow slits, each no wider than 1/8 of an inch, pointing downwards. The idea was to allow only a tiny sliver of light to escape, just enough to illuminate the ground immediately in front of the car. The light produced was officially described as being equivalent to a single candle. Think about that. You are driving a heavy metal machine and your only guide is a beam of light no brighter than a candle, showing you maybe 10 or 15 feet of road. The result was a terrifying driving experience. The speed limit in built-up areas was reduced to 20 miles per hour, but even that often felt dangerously fast. Drivers had to lean forward, squinting into the gloom, trying to make out the edge of the road, other cars, or pedestrians. The dim hooded light gave no peripheral vision. It was like driving through a narrow tunnel of darkness. Things would just appear out of nowhere. A person stepping off the curb, a parked car without its lights on, a cyclist. The time you had to react was almost zero. The statistics from the period are grim. In the United Kingdom, in the first 4 months of the war, from September to December 1939, road deaths nearly doubled compared to the same period the year before. Over 4,100 people were killed on the roads in that short time. It was a silent, grinding source of casualties happening every single night. A study published later in the Journal of Royal Statistical Society analyzed the data and confirmed the blackout was the primary cause. People were being killed not by enemy action, but by the very measures designed to protect them. To make things even harder, other lights were also gone. There were no traffic lights. A police officer often stood at major junctions trying to direct traffic with hand signals and a shielded torch, but on most roads you were on your own. There were no street lights, there were no lit shop windows to help you see. It was just you, your candle power headlights, and the oppressive, inky blackness. Drivers spoke of the immense strain, the headaches, the burning eyes from concentrating so hard. It was mentally and physically exhausting. Many people simply stopped driving at night unless it was an absolute emergency. But for doctors, delivery drivers, and essential workers, there was no choice. They had to venture out into the dangerous dark every single night. Despite the obvious dangers, the rule was strictly enforced. Being caught with improperly masked headlights would result in a heavy fine. The needs of national security trumped the safety of the individual on the road. It was a brutal calculation. What mysteries remain from this time? We have the official accident statistics, but how many incidents went unrecorded or were miscategorized, especially in the chaotic early days? Were there unapproved and therefore illegal headlight mask designs that were more effective, and did a black market for them exist among drivers desperate for a little more safety? And how many drivers suffered from what we would now call post-traumatic stress, born from the nightly terror of driving blind? Number 17, what happens when a whole city goes dark? It's hard to imagine a modern city without light. We are so used to the constant glow of streetlights, traffic signals, office buildings, and homes. In light is safety, it's navigation, it's life. The blackout took all of that away. The rule wasn't just about covering your windows at home. It was about extinguishing the public face of the city. Every single source of light had to be put out. Streetlights were switched off at the mains. Illuminated signs were forbidden. The glowing signs of cinemas, pubs, and shops went dark. Even the faint light from a telephone box was considered a risk and had to be masked. The effect was profound and disorienting. A city like London or Berlin, once a beacon of light and activity, was plunged into an unnatural prehistoric darkness. People who had lived in the same place their entire lives suddenly found themselves lost. Familiar streets became alien landscapes. You couldn't see the curb, you couldn't see the street signs, you couldn't see the person walking towards you until they were right upon you. Getting home from work, a simple daily routine became a perilous journey. People would count their steps, feel along walls with their hands, or listen for the familiar sound of a particular corner to find their way. This darkness created a whole new set of dangers. We've already talked about the increase in traffic accidents, but accidents of all kinds shot up. People fell into canals and rivers, they tripped on uneven pavement, they walked into lampposts and mailboxes. They tumbled down flights of stairs at public buildings and train stations. The British Ministry of Transport reported that in the first year of the blackout, the number of people killed in falls on the streets was 6 times higher than the previous year. It was a city full of invisible hazards. To try and combat this, some clever, low-tech solutions were devised. The edges of curbs were painted with white paint. The trunks of trees near the road were painted white, and lampposts and other obstacles were given a white stripe. The idea was that the faint starlight or moonlight might catch the white paint and give people a fighting chance of seeing the obstacle before they hit it. Pedestrians were encouraged to wear something white, like a scarf or an armband, or to pin a piece of newspaper to their coat to make themselves more visible to the already struggling drivers. These small acts of civilian ingenuity were a testament to how people adapted to this strange new world. The social fabric of the city also changed. The darkness provided cover. Crime rates, particularly for petty theft like muggings and burglaries, increased in some areas. The writer George Orwell, in his diaries from the period, noted the change in London's atmosphere. The city felt more menacing, more secretive. But the darkness also brought people together in strange ways. Strangers would help each other navigate a particularly tricky corner. There was a sense of shared vulnerability. The common complaint about stumbling in the dark was a great equalizer. Everyone, rich or poor, was in the same boat, fumbling their way through the night. The city, stripped of its artificial light, became a different entity, one that was both more dangerous and, in some ways, more intimate. What are the lingering questions about this citywide darkness? How did the complete lack of light pollution affect the urban wildlife and ecosystem in ways that were never studied at the time? We know about the rise in some crimes, but did the darkness also prevent others by making it harder for criminals to identify targets? And beyond the physical dangers, what was the deeper undocumented impact on civic identity when a city's defining landmarks and lit up public squares were erased from existence every single night? Number 16. Could a bucket of white paint save your life? In the overwhelming darkness of the blackout, the smallest things made a huge difference. One of the simplest and most widespread rules was the use of white paint. It sounds almost trivial, but it was a critical part of the civil defense strategy. The rule was straightforward. Anything that could be an obstacle to a pedestrian or a vehicle at night should be made as visible as possible without using light. The answer was white paint. Local councils and ARP services organized massive painting campaigns. Fleets of workers, many of them volunteers, went out onto the streets. They painted the edges of curbs for miles and miles. They painted white bands about, a foot high around the base of every lamppost, telegraph pole, and pillar box. The bumpers of cars, buses, and trucks were painted white. Even the fenders of bicycles were given a coat of white. The idea was that in the pitch black, the white surfaces would catch whatever ambient light was available, a sliver of moon, the faint glow of starlight, and stand out against the dark background. It was a passive, non-illuminated form of guidance. This simple act had a measurable impact. While accident rates were still tragically high, authorities believed the white paint prevented them from being even worse. It became a visual language of the blackout city. A driver, straining to see through his masked headlights, might catch the faint white line of the curb and know he was about to drift off the road. A pedestrian, shuffling along in the dark, might see the ghostly white shape of a lamppost just in time to avoid walking straight into it. These white markings were lifelines in a sea of black. The effort was continuous. The paint wore off quickly with traffic and weather. Repainting was a constant chore. The diaries of ARP wardens often mentioned spending their days organizing painting parties and their nights enforcing the light restrictions. It was a low-tech, labor-intensive solution to a high-tech problem. While bombers flew overhead with sophisticated engines, the people below were fighting back with paintbrushes. This rule also extended to personal attire. Government advice broadcast on the radio and printed in newspapers urged people to make themselves more visible. "Wear something white at night" became a common slogan. People would pin a white handkerchief to their sleeve, wear a white armband, or tie a white scarf around their neck. Some women took to carrying white handbags. It was a form of personal responsibility. Just as you had a duty to black out your home, you had a duty to make yourself less of a hazard to others when you went outside. The historian Juliette Gardner, in her book Wartime Britain 1939 to 1945, highlights how these small personal adjustments became part of the collective war effort. They were tiny acts of civic duty. Of course, it wasn't a perfect system. On a truly moonless, overcast night, even white paint was swallowed by the darkness. And the paint itself could cause confusion. A splotch of spilled white paint on the road could be mistaken for an object, causing a driver to swerve dangerously. But despite its flaws, the white paint strategy was a vital adaptation. It showed a society grappling with an unprecedented problem and finding a simple, practical way to mitigate it. It was a symbol of resilience, a quiet act of defiance, painted onto the very streets of the city. But what don't we know? How many tons of white paint were actually used across the country during the war years? And what was the environmental impact of the lead-based paints common at the time? Were there controlled studies conducted in secret, comparing accident rates in painted versus unpainted areas that have since been lost? And did criminals ever use white paint for nefarious purposes, creating fake obstacles or markings to cause accidents for the purpose of robbery? Number 15, who was that stranger banging on your door? During the blackout, there was one sound that could fill a household with a mix of irritation and dread: a loud, insistent knock on the door, followed by a booming voice shouting, "Put that light out!" This was the cry of the Air Raid Precautions, or ARP, warden. They were the sentinels of the darkness, the enforcers of the blackout rules. The rule was that the blackout had to be observed by everyone, and the ARP wardens were there to make sure it happened. They were civilian volunteers, ordinary men and women who were given this extraordinary power over their neighbors. In Britain, the ARP service was established in 1937 in anticipation of conflict. By the time the war started, it was a massive organization. By 1940, there were over 1.5 million people serving as ARP wardens. They were typically men who were too old or not medically fit for military service, and many were women. As they were issued a steel helmet, a gas mask, and a whistle. They didn't carry weapons. Their authority came from the defense regulations, a set of emergency laws passed at the start of the war. Their primary job during the blackout was to patrol the streets, sector by sector, and look for any sliver of light escaping from a building. It was a thankless task. They walked for hours in the cold and the dark, often in terrible weather. They had to be meticulous. They would stare at a row of houses, looking for the faintest glow. When they spotted one, their duty was clear. They had to approach the house, bang on the door, and order the occupant to fix the problem immediately. This created a strange social dynamic. Your local grocer or the man who lived down the street was suddenly a figure of authority, empowered to shout at you and even report you to the police. This led to a lot of friction. People who were trying their best to comply with the rules would get angry when a warden spotted a tiny, accidental crack of light. The wardens were often seen as busybodies, petty tyrants on a power trip. They were the subject of many jokes and cartoons, often depicted as pompous and officious. The popular British comedy show of the era, It's That Man Again, frequently poked fun at the ARP warden character. But their job was deadly serious. A light wasn't just an infraction, it was a potential danger to the entire community. And their duties went far beyond just enforcing the blackout. When the air raid sirens wailed, the wardens were the first responders. They guided people to public shelters. They carried messages. After a bombing, they would be the first on the scene, helping to rescue people from collapsed buildings, putting out small fires with sandbags and water pumps, and administering first aid. They were the backbone of the civil defense system. The comedian and writer Norman Longmate, in his book, How We Lived Then, compiled many first-hand accounts that paint a picture of the wardens' bravery and dedication in the face of incredible danger. So, while they were often resented for their role as blackout police, they were also respected for their courage. They were the human link between the government's regulations and the reality of life on the ground. They were the ones who had to knock on the door and deliver bad news, and they were the ones who would pull you from the rubble. They were the complicated, sometimes annoying, but ultimately essential guardians of the dark. What crucial details about the ARP have been lost to time? How did the psychological profile of the average warden volunteer differ from that of the general population, and were they more prone to anxiety or a need for control? We know they reported infractions, but did they also keep unofficial logs of problem households or suspicious activities that were never passed on to the police? And how many wardens used their position of power for personal gain or to settle old scores with neighbors, a dark side of the service that would have been almost impossible to officially report or prove? Number 14, what was the real price of a lighted window? The blackout rules were not polite requests. They were the law, and breaking them had serious consequences. The government needed to ensure total compliance because the system only worked if everyone participated. A single person deciding the rules didn't apply to them could, in theory, endanger thousands. So, the penalties for violating the blackout had to be severe enough to act as a real deterrent. The primary law governing the blackout in Britain was the Defense Regulation 24. It stated that no light shall be displayed during the hours of darkness. The enforcement of this fell to the police and the ARP wardens. If a warden saw a light, their first step was usually to shout a warning. If the light wasn't extinguished immediately, or if the household was a repeat offender, the warden would report them. This would lead to a visit from the police and a summons to appear in court. The fines were substantial, especially by the standards of the day. For a simple blackout offense, a person could be fined up to £50. To put that in perspective, in 1940, the average weekly wage for a male manual worker was around £3. So, a £50 fine was more than 3 months' wages. It was a crippling amount of money for an ordinary family. For more serious offenses, such as deliberately showing a light to aid the enemy, the penalties could include imprisonment. And newspapers from the period are filled with short columns listing the names and addresses of people who were fined for blackout offenses. It was a form of public shaming as well as a legal punishment. The historian A.J.P. Taylor noted that these court proceedings were a key way the state demonstrated its authority and the seriousness of the home front effort. This created a climate of fear and anxiety. People were terrified of making a mistake. They would double and triple check their blackout curtains. The stress of a potential fine was another layer of worry on top of all the other anxieties of wartime. There were stories, some perhaps apocryphal, of people being fined for striking a match in the street to light a cigarette or for using a torch without a proper shield. The courts were generally not sympathetic. The magistrates understood that the blackout was a matter of national security. Excuses like, "I forgot," or "the curtain must have slipped," were rarely accepted. The records of these court cases show a system that was designed to be strict. The goal was to make an example of offenders to ensure that everyone else towed the line. This strict enforcement wasn't just about lights from homes. Businesses were also heavily fined. A factory that failed to properly black out its skylights could face enormous penalties. This legal pressure had a profound effect on the community. It sometimes fostered a sense of shared discipline. But it could also turn neighbors against each other. A person might report their neighbor not just out of civic duty, but also out of spite. The blackout regulations gave people a tool to use in personal disputes. The fear of being reported was a powerful force for social control. It was a system that relied on a combination of community spirit and the threat of punishment. The price of a lighted window wasn't just a potential fine, it was also the risk of social ostracism and the heavy weight of being seen as someone who wasn't doing their part. Or, what do we not understand about the enforcement of these rules? How much variation in fines and sentencing was there from one court to another? And did your chance of a heavy penalty depend entirely on the personal prejudices of the local magistrate? Are there records of people who were wrongfully accused by malicious neighbors and what happened to them? And how many people were financially ruined by these fines, losing their homes or businesses, a hidden economic casualty of the home front that has never been quantified? Number 13, was your garden a threat to national security? The blackout regulations extended far beyond the windows of a house. They covered any and all sources of light, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. This meant that many normal everyday activities were suddenly forbidden. One of the most surprising rules for many people was the complete ban on bonfires, garden incinerators, and even flaming torches. The logic was the same as for a lighted window. From the air, a bonfire is a bright, unmistakable point of light. It's even more visible than a lamp, as the flames flicker and dance, catching the eye. A series of bonfires could be used as signals, either intentionally by spies or accidentally by people just cleaning up their gardens. During the day, the column of smoke from a bonfire could also act as a navigational marker. So, for reasons of national security, the simple act of burning your garden waste was outlawed. This was a major inconvenience. In an era before organized weekly trash collection in many areas, burning rubbish was a common way to dispose of it. And gardeners who had spent the day pruning trees or clearing weeds were left with large piles of green waste and no way to get rid of it. They had to either let it rot in a compost heap or find other ways to dispose of it, which was not always easy. The regulation was part of a broader set of rules about controlling outdoor lights of any kind. This included things like fireworks, which were completely banned for the duration of the war. Even something as simple as a barbecue was technically illegal at night if it produced a visible glow. The ban on torches was also critical. Carrying a lit torch in the open air was strictly forbidden. This had implications for certain types of work and for traditional events. The Guy Fawkes Night in Britain on November 5th, a festival traditionally celebrated with huge bonfires and fireworks, was effectively canceled for 6 years. The cultural impact of this was significant. A cherished national tradition had to be set aside for the war effort. The historian Norman Longmate notes that these interruptions to the normal rhythm of life were a constant reminder of the state of emergency. Enforcement fell once again to the ARP wardens and the police. A warden on patrol who saw the telltale glow of a fire in a backyard would have to investigate immediately. The homeowner would be ordered to extinguish it and could face a fine. People were encouraged to report any fires they saw. This created a situation where your private garden was no longer truly private. It was a space that was under constant surveillance, a potential threat to the entire community. This rule demonstrates the totality of the blackout. It wasn't just about what happened inside your house. It was about controlling the entire nighttime environment. Every single person, in every aspect of their life, had to think about whether their actions could create light. It changed the way people managed their property and their land. The simple, rustic image of a gardener leaning on a rake next to a smoking pile of leaves became a thing of the past, a nostalgic memory of a more peaceful time. The war reached right into your backyard and told you that even there, you were not free to do as you pleased. What unanswered questions remain about this rule? We know bonfires were banned, but how did this affect agriculture? Were farmers given special exemptions for practices like stubble burning? And if so, how were these managed to avoid creating a security risk? Did the ban on burning waste lead to any unforeseen public health consequences like an increase in pests due to rotting garbage? And is it possible that enemy intelligence ever tried to use a series of small, cleverly disguised fires as a covert signaling system? A threat the authorities feared but could never publicly confirm. Number 12, how do you build war machines in total darkness? The blackout presented a huge challenge for industry. Factories, shipyards, and steel mills were the engine of the war effort. They had to operate 24 hours a day to produce the planes, tanks, ships, and munitions that were desperately needed. But these industrial sites were also prime targets for enemy bombers. A brightly lit factory complex at night was a giant bullseye, a gift to the enemy. So, how could you run a massive industrial operation in complete darkness? The rule was the same for factories as it was for homes. No light could be visible from the outside. But the scale of the problem was immense. A factory might have thousands of windows and huge skylights in the roof. All of this had to be blacked out. The first step was often to paint over all the glass with thick black industrial paint. This was a massive undertaking requiring huge amounts of paint and labor. For windows that needed to be open for ventilation, special frames with blackout cloth were built. The real challenge was the nature of the work itself. Many industrial processes created their own light. A steel mill, with its blast furnaces and white-hot metal, glowed with an intense light. Shipyards used bright arc welders that lit up the night sky. These processes couldn't just be stopped, so elaborate structures had to be built to hide them. Huge sheds, like giant blackout curtains, were sometimes constructed over the top of the most luminous operations. Stricter rules were put in place. For example, the doors to a furnace room had to be on a two-door system, like an airlock, so that the inner door was closed before the outer door was opened, preventing any flash of light from escaping. Inside these blacked-out factories, conditions were often terrible. The painted-over windows meant there was no natural light during the day. The buildings were perpetually lit by artificial, often inadequate lighting. Ventilation, which was already a problem in heavy industry, became even worse. The air would be thick with fumes, dust, and smoke. The combination of poor light and bad air led to an increase in workplace accidents. The pressure to produce was immense, and workers, both men and women, toiled for long hours in these grim, unhealthy environments. The industrial psychologist J.F.S. Ross conducted studies during the war on worker fatigue and productivity, and his findings pointed to the poor environmental conditions as a major factor. Despite these challenges, the system worked. The industrial heartlands of countries like Britain and Germany were effectively hidden from the sky. Reconnaissance flights would pass over, and where there should have been a sprawling, glowing factory complex, there was just an inert patch of darkness. It was a remarkable feat of engineering and discipline. It required the full cooperation of factory owners, managers, and the millions of workers on the factory floor. And everyone understood what was at stake. The production lines had to keep moving, but they had to do so in secret, hidden under a nationwide cloak of invisibility. The drone of machinery inside the dark, stuffy factories was the hidden heartbeat of the war effort. What are the untold stories of this industrial blackout? How much did the poor lighting and ventilation in blacked-out factories contribute to long-term health problems for the wartime generation of workers, an issue that was likely never tracked? Were there secret industrial sites so vital to the war effort that they were built entirely underground or inside mountains from the start to avoid the blackout problem altogether? And how many acts of industrial sabotage were successfully disguised as accidents, made plausible by the genuinely dangerous working conditions of the blackout factory? Number 11, where did people go to escape the dark? In a world that was physically and psychologically dark, people desperately needed an escape. They needed entertainment, a place to forget their worries for a few hours. The cinema and the theater became more important than ever. They were oases of light, glamour, and storytelling in the middle of the blackout. But how could a place designed to attract attention with bright lights and big crowds operate under strict blackout rules? Really, the rule was that entertainment venues had to be just as lightproof as any home or factory. This meant that the grand, brightly lit entrances of cinemas and theaters had to go dark. The flashing signs were turned off, the posters were barely visible in the gloom. Getting into the building itself was a challenge. Cinemas had to install light locks at their entrances. This was usually a system of two sets of heavy black curtains or a set of double doors. You would go through the first door into a small dark space and wait for it to close behind you before the second door into the foyer was opened. This prevented any of the light from the inside from spilling out onto the street. Once inside, it was a different world. The lights were on, the music was playing, and for a couple of hours, you could be transported somewhere else. The popularity of cinema soared during the war. In Britain, cinema attendance reached an all-time high, with around 30 million tickets sold every week by 1945. People flocked to see comedies, musicals, and patriotic films. Hollywood stars like Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman became symbols of a more glamorous world, far away from the daily grind of rationing and air raids. The scholar Antonia Lant, in her book Blackout: Reinventing the Space of Cinema, argues that the cinema became a vital space for maintaining public morale. It was a place where the community could come together and share an experience, but the war was never far away. If the air raid siren sounded during a film, a notice would be projected onto the screen. It would say something like, "An air raid warning is in effect. Those who wish to leave may do so. The performance will continue." Most people chose to stay. The cinema, with its sturdy construction, often felt safer than their own homes. The show quite literally had to go on. Ushers and usherettes were trained in first aid and how to evacuate the building in an emergency. They were part of the civil defense network, responsible for the safety of hundreds of people. Getting home after the show was another matter. You would leave the bright, warm world of the cinema and be plunged back into the cold, disorienting darkness of the blackout. The journey home was often the most dangerous part of the evening. People had to navigate the dark streets, tripping over curbs and bumping into each other. But for most, it was worth it. The chance to escape, to laugh, to be thrilled was a vital tonic for the soul. The cinema was a little pocket of light and life, carefully sealed off from the darkness outside. What aspects of this blackout entertainment world are still a mystery? We know attendance was high, but were there secret, unofficial cinemas operating in basements or back rooms that flouted the rules? Did the constant transition from the bright cinema back into the pitch black have any lasting documented effects on people's eyesight or psychological state? And how many romantic relationships or clandestine meetings only happened because of the unique, anonymizing darkness of the streets outside the cinema after a show? Number 10, why was a rubber mask your constant companion? One of the most defining rules of life on the home front had nothing to do with light, but it was a constant presence in the background of the blackout. This was the rule that you had to carry your gas mask with you at all times. The fear of a gas attack was pervasive, especially in the early years of the war. Memories of the horrific use of poison gas in the First World War were still fresh in the public mind. It was widely believed that the enemy would use gas bombs against civilian populations. So governments undertook a massive effort to equip every single citizen with a gas mask. In Britain, over 38 million gas masks were distributed to the civilian population in 1938 and 1939, even before the war officially began. There were different models. The standard adult mask had a single large eyepiece and a snout-like filter canister. There were special, smaller masks for children, often colored red and blue and nicknamed Mickey Mouse masks in an attempt to make them less frightening. For babies, there was a cumbersome helmet-like device that enclosed the child's entire head with a hand pump that the parent had to operate to supply air. The rule was simple. You were expected to have your gas mask with you wherever you went. They were issued in a simple cardboard box with a string to sling over your shoulder. People quickly found more stylish or practical ways to carry them, and a whole cottage industry of fashionable gas mask handbags appeared. But whether it was in a plain box or a fancy leather case, the gas mask became a constant, cumbersome accessory. You took it to work. You took it shopping. You took it to the cinema. School children had to carry theirs to class every day. There were regular gas mask drills where a teacher or an air warden would give the signal and everyone would have to practice putting on their masks as quickly as possible. The official target was to be able to do it in under 15 seconds. Living with the gas mask was a strange experience. The rubber had a distinctive, unpleasant smell. The eyepieces, made of celluloid, would fog up easily. It was difficult to breathe, and your voice sounded strange and distorted. Wearing one was a claustrophobic and isolating experience. But the fear that prompted this was very real. The government produced posters and films showing what to do in a gas attack. People were taught to recognize the smell of different types of gas. Phosgene was said to smell like musty hay, mustard gas like garlic or horseradish. As the war went on and a major gas attack on civilians never materialized, people became more complacent. Many started leaving their gas masks at home, tired of carrying the bulky boxes everywhere. This led to government poster campaigns with slogans like, "Hitler will send no warning." So always carry your gas mask to remind people of the potential danger. The abandoned gas mask became a symbol of a public that was growing weary of the constant state of alert. The historian Martin F. Foley has written about how the gas mask's journey from essential equipment to forgotten nuisance reflects the changing public mood and perception of risk as the war progressed. The gas mask is a powerful symbol of the psychological reality of the home front. For millions of people, it was a constant, tangible reminder of their own mortality, of the new and terrifying ways that war could reach out and touch them, even in their own homes and streets. It was a part of the uniform of civilian life, a heavy burden that thankfully most never had to use for its intended purpose. What are the great unknowns surrounding the gas mask program? We know millions were made, but how many were faulty? And were the results of quality control tests suppressed to avoid public panic? What were the long-term health effects for people who breathed in small amounts of the asbestos that was used in the filters of some early models? And were there ever small, unconfirmed gas attacks that were covered up by the authorities to prevent mass hysteria, leaving historians with only rumors and anecdotal evidence? Number 9, could you fight a fire with a bucket of sand? In the event of an air raid, the blackout was the first line of defense. But if a bomb did get through, the second line of defense was the ordinary citizen. The rule was that every household should be prepared to fight small fires. The enemy was expected to use not just high explosive bombs, but also thousands of small incendiary bombs. These were devices designed not to explode, but to burn fiercely and start fires. A single bomber could drop hundreds of them with the aim of overwhelming the fire brigade by starting more fires than they could possibly handle. The responsibility for tackling these small fires fell to the residents of the houses they hit. The government, through the Ministry of Home Security, issued detailed instructions on how to do this. The primary weapons were surprisingly low-tech buckets of sand and buckets of water. Every home was advised to have several buckets of water ready at all times. More importantly, they needed a sand bucket. The advice was to use dry sand to smother the flames of an incendiary bomb. Throwing water directly onto one could cause it to explode or burn more violently. So, a new piece of furniture appeared in the hallways of British homes, the sand bucket. People also kept stirrup pumps, which were small, hand-operated water pumps. One person would put the base of the pump into a bucket of water, and another would direct the nozzle at the base of the fire. These were simple but effective tools. ARP wardens would go door to door, checking that households had their firefighting equipment ready. Fire-watching rotas were established for streets and businesses. People would take turns staying up all night, watching from rooftops or windows, ready to act the moment an incendiary bomb fell. The classic incendiary device used in the early part of the war was a small thermite bomb. It would burn with incredible heat, around 2,500 degrees Celsius. The official advice was to approach it, take cover behind a door or a piece of furniture, and use a long-handled shovel or scoop to dump sand on it. Once the fire was under control, the device could be scooped up and dropped into a bucket of water to cool it down. This was incredibly dangerous work for untrained civilians. The image of a mild-mannered accountant or shopkeeper in his pajamas battling a fiercely burning bomb in his own attic became a defining image of civilian courage. These preparations were not just theoretical. During the intense bombing campaigns, they were put into practice night after night. Thousands of fires were successfully extinguished by ordinary people using these simple methods. The efforts of these civilian firefighters saved countless homes and prevented small fires from growing into major conflagrations that could have destroyed entire city blocks. The diaries and letters collected by historians like Philip Ziegler are filled with personal accounts of these terrifying but often successful battles. It was a privatized, democratized form of firefighting born of necessity. The defense of the city was placed directly into the hands of its inhabitants. What mysteries about this civilian firefighting effort persist? We know the official advice, but what unofficial, and perhaps more effective, methods of fighting incendiaries were developed by ordinary people on the ground and passed along by word of mouth? How many people were killed or seriously injured while trying to tackle these devices in incidents that were lost in the chaos of a major air raid and never officially recorded? And did the enemy ever develop new types of incendiary devices designed specifically to counter these civilian firefighting techniques, engaging in a hidden technological arms race in the attics and living rooms of their targets? Number 8, when the sirens wailed, where did you hide? The blackout was designed to prevent attacks, but when prevention failed and the mournful, rising and falling wail of the air raid siren cut through the night, a new set of rules came into play. The primary rule was to take shelter immediately. The question for millions of people was where. For many, the first and most obvious place of shelter was under their own roof. The government issued advice on how to make your home safer. The safest place was said to be under the stairs, as the staircase provided extra structural reinforcement. Families would huddle together in the cupboard under the stairs, often for hours at a time, listening to the terrifying sounds of the raid outside. Some people were issued with an indoor shelter called the Morrison Shelter, named after the Home Secretary Herbert Morrison. It was essentially a heavy steel table with wire mesh sides. It was designed to protect the people underneath from a collapsing house. It was delivered in a flat pack and had to be assembled inside the house, usually in the living room. It often doubled as a dining table during the day. For those with a garden, there was the Anderson Shelter, named after Sir John Anderson, the minister in charge of air raid precautions. This was a shelter made of corrugated steel sheets, designed to be partly buried in the garden and covered with earth. It could hold about 6 people. Over 2 million of them were distributed to families with lower incomes. They were cold, damp, and cramped, but they were remarkably effective at protecting people from anything other than a direct hit. Many people personalized their Anderson shelters, planting flowers on top or decorating the inside. They became a strange, subterranean extension of the family home. For people living in flats or without gardens, the options were different. Many apartment buildings had their basements reinforced to act as communal shelters. In some cities, large public shelters were built, but the most iconic public shelters were the underground train stations. In London, the platforms of the tube stations became vast, unofficial dormitories. Thousands of people would stream down into the stations every night, carrying their bedding and flasks of tea. It was not officially sanctioned at first, but the public took matters into their own hands, and the government eventually had to accept it and provide bunk beds and sanitation. The photographer Bill Brandt captured famous, haunting images of people sleeping on the platforms, a whole city gone to ground. Life in the shelters had its own rules and its own culture. There was a strong sense of community. People shared food, told stories, and sang songs to keep their spirits up. But there were also tensions. The shelters were crowded and noisy. There was little privacy, and there was always the fear. The ground would shake with the impact of the bombs, and dust would fall from the ceiling. You were trapped underground with no idea what was happening in the world above. It was a shared experience of fear and endurance, a nightly ritual for millions of people. What do we still not know about the shelter experience? How did the unique microbial environment of the crowded, poorly ventilated shelters affect public health, potentially spreading diseases like tuberculosis in ways that were never officially traced back to their source? We have official records of shelter capacity, but what was the real number of people using unofficial or improvised shelters, like caves or cellars, that were never part of any government survey? And what are the untold stories of the social hierarchies, the conflicts and the acts of great kindness or terrible selfishness that played out in the darkness of the shelters night after night? Number 7, was there a difference between dark and pitch black? The term blackout suggests a total absence of light, a uniform, absolute darkness. But the reality was more complicated. As the war progressed, the rules around lighting were subtly adjusted based on the perceived level of threat. This led to a distinction between a full blackout and a dim out. The rule, in essence, was that the level of darkness could vary. In the early days of the war, and during periods of intense aerial attack, the rules were for a complete and total blackout. This was the pitch black, zero tolerance darkness we have been discussing. Every chink of light was a major offense. This was the standard for most of the war in major European cities. However, in other places, and at other times, a slightly more relaxed set of rules, often called a dim out or starlight lighting, was permitted. This was particularly common in the United States after it entered the war, especially in coastal cities. The fear there was not so much of bombers targeting the city itself, but of the city's glow creating a bright backdrop against which ships at sea could be silhouetted, making them easy targets for submarines. The goal of the coastal dim out was not to make the city invisible, but just to reduce its sky glow. Under dim-out regulations, the rules were a little different. Streetlights might be allowed to operate, but at a much reduced power, and they had to be shielded so that no light was cast upwards. Headlights on cars might have less restrictive masks. People might be allowed a small amount of light to show from their windows, as long as it was very dim. The idea was to create a level of light that was just enough for people to see and move around safely, but not enough to be a significant aid to enemy navigation from the air or sea. Harold F. Ickes, who served as the U.S. Petroleum Coordinator for War, was a key figure in debating and implementing these regulations, trying to balance civilian safety and morale with military necessity. This created a confusing situation. The rules could change from one day to the next. A city might be in a dim out, but if an air raid alert was sounded, it would immediately revert to a full blackout. People had to be constantly aware of the current regulations. The subtle difference between dark enough and too dark was a matter of official policy. This also reflected the different philosophies of civil defense. The British model, born of the experience of being directly and heavily bombed, tended towards the most extreme measures. The American model, with the threat being more distant, could afford to be a little more lenient. But even in Britain, there were debates. Some officials argued that the psychological and safety costs of the total blackout were too high, and that a properly managed dim out would be almost as effective and far less damaging to civilian life. These arguments were generally overruled by the military, who preferred the maximum possible level of precaution. The dim out shows that the blackout was not a single monolithic concept. It was a dynamic set of regulations constantly being tweaked and reevaluated. It was a science as well as an art, an attempt to find the precise point on the spectrum between light and darkness that offered the best compromise between safety and the ability to carry on with some semblance of normal life. What key questions about the dim out remain unanswered? Were there secret military experiments conducted over cities using reconnaissance aircraft to determine the exact level of light that became visible from different altitudes, a science of darkness whose results are still classified? How many submarine attacks were successful precisely because one city's dim out regulations were more lax than another's? And did the constant shifting between blackout and dim out rules create a level of public confusion that actually led to more accidents than a single consistent policy would have? Number 6, how did a tiny flashlight become a lifeline? In the profound darkness of the blackout, any source of personal light was a precious commodity, but even a simple flashlight, or torch as it was known in Britain, was subject to strict rules. You couldn't just wander around with a bright, powerful beam. That would be just as bad as a lit window. The rule was that any torch used outdoors had to be dimmed. The officially approved method for dimming your torch was to cover the glass with 1 or 2 layers of tissue paper, held in place with a rubber band. The light had to be directed downwards at all times. You were not supposed to shine it up or around. The beam of light should be just enough to see the ground at your feet, to help you avoid tripping on the curb or walking into a puddle. It was a tiny circle of personal light in a vast public darkness. These torches became essential pieces of equipment for anyone who had to go out at night. They were a lifeline, but they also brought their own problems. Batteries were in short supply. They were needed for military equipment, so civilian supplies were limited. People would use their torch batteries sparingly, turning them on for just a second or two at a time to get their bearings before plunging back into darkness. The bulbs were also fragile and could be hard to replace. A working torch with a good battery was a valuable possession. The importance of the torch is highlighted in countless personal memoirs from the period. People wrote about the panic they felt when their battery died unexpectedly, leaving them stranded in an unfamiliar street. They wrote about the small kindness of a stranger, briefly sharing their torch beam to help them find a keyhole. The torch was a tool not just for navigation, but for security. It provided a small measure of control in a disorienting environment. The writer and social commentator J.B. Priestley, in his famous wartime radio broadcasts, often spoke about the small, everyday objects and routines that help people cope, and the dim torch was certainly one of them. The rule about dimming the torch was enforced just like any other blackout regulation. An ARP warden who saw someone using an unshielded torch would tell them to cover it up. If you were caught shining a torch upwards, you could be suspected of signaling to the enemy and find yourself in very serious trouble. The humble flashlight shows how the blackout affected life at the most minute personal level. It turned a simple, useful object into something that was both essential and regulated. It was a tiny, private rebellion against the enforced public darkness, but a rebellion that had to follow the rules. Your personal safety and being able to see where you were going was constantly balanced against the collective security of remaining invisible. The small tissue paper covered beam of a blackout torch is a perfect metaphor for the constrained and cautious way that people had to navigate their lives during those years. What do we not know about the use of these torches? Was there a black market for high-quality, long-lasting batteries, and how was it organized? We know the official way to dim a torch, but what other ingenious homemade methods did people invent to create a better or more reliable light source? And did crime statistics show a correlation between assaults at night and whether the victim was carrying a torch, suggesting that the small light could make you a target as well as keep you safe? Number 5, how did an entire country keep moving in the dark? A country at war needs its public transportation system to function efficiently. People need to get to their jobs in the factories, troops need to be moved, and supplies need to be transported. But how do you run a network of trains and buses when the entire country is in a blackout? The rules for public transport were incredibly complex and challenging. For buses, the regulations were similar to those for cars. They had to use masked headlights, which made driving incredibly difficult for the bus drivers who were maneuvering large, heavy vehicles. The interior of the bus also had to be kept dark. The windows were fitted with blackout screens or painted over. The interior lights were dimmed and shaded, often casting a faint, eerie blue glow that was just enough for people to find their seats. Getting on or off the bus was treacherous. The steps were hard to see, and you would step out of the dim interior into complete blackness. Trains faced an even bigger challenge. The light and sparks from a steam engine's firebox could be seen from miles away. Special screens had to be fitted to hide this glow. The passenger carriages were a particular problem. A long, lit-up train moving through the dark countryside would be an unmissable target. The window blinds in every carriage had to be kept down at all times during the hours of darkness. A railway official would walk the length of the train before it departed, checking every single window. If a blind was found to be up during the journey, the train could be stopped. The lighting inside the carriages was also drastically reduced. Often the main lights were turned off, and only a few, very dim blue-tinted bulbs were left on. This made it almost impossible to read. The atmosphere on these blackout trains was described as strange and ghostly. People sat in near silence, unable to see each other clearly, peering out into a black void. Train stations were also dark and dangerous places. The platforms were unlit, except for a few heavily shaded lamps. Finding the right train and getting on it safely was a major challenge. The historian and broadcaster Ian Carter has documented how the railways managed to operate under these extreme conditions, calling it one of the unsung logistical triumphs of the war. This commitment to keeping the country moving despite the darkness was vital. It was a testament to the discipline and resilience of the transport workers, to the bus drivers, train drivers, conductors, and station staff. They worked under immense pressure and in dangerous conditions to ensure that the arteries of the nation did not seize up. The familiar rhythmic clatter of a train on the tracks at night, or the low rumble of a bus making its way through the dark streets, were sounds of reassurance. They were proof that even in the deepest, most oppressive darkness, life and the war effort carried on. What are the lost stories from this era of dark transport? How many accidents on the railways and bus networks were directly caused by the blackout, but were officially attributed to other causes to maintain public confidence in the system? Were there secret ghost trains with no lights at all, used for transporting top secret materials or personnel that ran on schedules known only to a handful of people? And what was the psychological toll on the drivers and engineers who had to navigate their complex routes, night after night, with almost no visual information, a feat of memory and nerve that has gone largely unrecorded? Number 4, did the darkness change who people were? The blackout was a physical condition, but it had profound psychological effects. The rules dictated how people lived in the dark, but the darkness itself changed how people felt and behaved. For nearly 6 years, the normal rhythm of day and night was disrupted. The night, once a time for social activity and entertainment, became a time of confinement and anxiety. This had a deep and lasting impact on the collective psyche. One of the most widely reported effects was a sense of depression and gloom, often referred to as blackout blues. The long, dark winter evenings were particularly hard. Being cooped up in stuffy, blacked out houses for hours on end led to feelings of isolation and claustrophobia. The lack of sunlight, even during the day because of painted windows, could have contributed to what we now understand as seasonal affective disorder, SAD. The Mass Observation Archive contains many diary entries where people describe their low spirits, irritability, and a general sense of weariness, which they directly attributed to the endless darkness. The darkness also changed social interactions. On the one hand, it could foster a sense of anonymity that was liberating for some. People felt less inhibited in the dark. This led to a widely reported increase in public displays of affection and a general loosening of social mores. The darkness of parks and alleyways provided cover for romantic encounters. The sociologist Tom Harrison, one of the founders of mass observation, noted this phenomenon, suggesting the blackout created a new kind of social landscape. On the other hand, the darkness created an environment of fear and suspicion. Every stranger you passed in the street was a potential threat. The inability to see people's faces made it hard to trust. Rumors of crime and spies using the darkness as cover were rampant. The darkness could make people more selfish and less considerate. There were complaints about people bumping into each other without apologizing or pushing and shoving to get on a dark bus. The normal civilities of public life were eroded by the difficulty and stress of simply moving around. The blackout fundamentally altered people's relationship with their environment. They learned to navigate using their other senses, their hearing, their sense of touch. They became acutely aware of the texture of the pavement under their feet, the sound of footsteps approaching, the feel of a familiar wall. It was a sensory re-education, but it also created a constant low-level stress. The body and mind were always on alert, trying to compensate for the lack of vision. This state of heightened awareness was mentally exhausting. The long-term effects of this sustained stress on the wartime generation are impossible to calculate, but they were undoubtedly significant. The darkness was not just an absence of light, it was a powerful presence that shaped people's emotions, their relationships, and their very perception of the world. What fundamental questions about the psychology of the blackout remain unanswered? Did the prolonged exposure to darkness in childhood have any measurable impact on the visual or cognitive development of the blackout babies, like a generation born and raised in this environment? Is it possible to trace a link between the blackout and post-war trends in art, literature, or even urban planning, suggesting the experience subconsciously reshaped cultural aesthetics? And how many acts of kindness and altruism performed under the cloak of anonymity provided by the darkness went completely unrecorded, leaving us with a historical record that may be skewed towards the negative and fearful aspects of the experience? Number 3, what happened to the pets and livestock? The blackout rules were designed for people, but humans don't live in a vacuum. The darkness also had a huge impact on the lives of animals, both domestic pets and agricultural livestock. The regulations had to account for them, and their owners had to find ways to care for them in this strange new world. For pet owners, the blackout created a host of new problems. The rule was that no light should be visible from outside, which meant that when you opened your door at night, you couldn't have a light on in the hallway. This made the simple act of letting a dog or cat out into the garden a complicated maneuver. People would have to shield the door or turn off all the lights before opening it. Many pets, particularly dogs, were frightened by the air raid sirens and the sound of bombs. Owners had to find ways to comfort their terrified animals in the dark, cramped conditions of an air raid shelter. There was also a tragic side to the story. In the first few days of the war in Britain, in September 1939, there was a mass euthanasia of pets. Fearing a food shortage and believing they would not be able to care for their animals during bombing raids, an estimated 750,000 pets were put down by their owners. This event, documented by the historian Hilda Keane in her book The Great Cat and Dog Massacre, was prompted by a public panic, fueled in part by official advice that suggested this as an option if people could not send their pets to the countryside. It was a heartbreaking start to the war for many families. For those who did keep their pets, the blackout added another layer of responsibility and worry. For farmers, the blackout was a logistical nightmare. Farm work often needs to happen at all hours, especially during calving or lambing season. But the use of lanterns in a barn or a field was strictly forbidden. A lit barn in the middle of the dark countryside would be an incredibly conspicuous landmark for an enemy aircraft. Farmers had to learn to do their work by the dim, shielded light of a special blackout lantern, or sometimes by touch alone. The historian Jonathan Brown has written about the immense challenges faced by the agricultural sector, which was already struggling with labor shortages. Livestock in fields near roads were a major hazard. In the darkness, cars could easily hit a cow or a sheep that had wandered onto the road. Some farmers took to painting their animals with white stripes, just like the lampposts, to make them more visible. The image of a herd of cows with white painted rumps is one of the more surreal, yet practical, adaptations of the Blackout era. The war demanded that every aspect of life, even the lives of animals, be subordinated to the single, overriding goal of national survival. The rules of the darkness applied to all creatures, great and small. What are the lingering mysteries about animals in the Blackout? How did the complete absence of artificial light affect the behavior and migration patterns of nocturnal wildlife? And did it lead to a temporary resurgence of certain species in urban areas? We know about the initial pet massacre, but what was the true unrecorded number of pets that were lost or abandoned during the chaos of evacuations and bombing raids throughout the war? And for livestock, were there secret government programs to develop non-luminous identification tags or other technologies to help manage animals in the dark, innovations that were never made public? Number 2, how do you learn to live with light? Again, for years, darkness had meant safety, and light had meant danger. This was a fundamental truth that had been drilled into an entire population. And then one day, it was over, the blackout regulations were lifted. In Britain, this happened in stages, but the final end of the blackout in much of Europe came in May 1945. The rule was simple. You could turn on the lights. But after so long living in the dark, how did people react to the sudden return of light? The celebration was euphoric. People tore down their blackout curtains and, in some cases, burned them in celebratory bonfires in the streets. For the first time in years, cities were illuminated, streetlights flickered on, the lights of houses blazed from open windows, famous landmarks were floodlit. In London, Buckingham Palace and the Houses of Parliament were lit up, and vast crowds gathered to see the spectacle. It was a powerful, emotional moment. The light was a symbol of victory, of the end of a long, dark ordeal. The journalist and broadcaster Winford Vaughan Thomas described the scene in London on Victory in Europe Day as a city that was, for the first time in all those years, unashamed of its own light. But the adjustment was not always easy. For children who had grown up during the war, a brightly lit city at night was a completely new and sometimes frightening experience. They had never known anything but the blackout. For adults, there was a strange, lingering sense of unease. For years, a light in the window had triggered a conditioned response of fear and anxiety. It took time to unlearn that. People spoke of feeling exposed and vulnerable in the brightly lit streets. The darkness had been oppressive, but it had also been a familiar cloak. The sudden brightness felt glaring and unnatural. There were also practical problems. The electrical infrastructure was old and had not been well maintained during the war. The sudden surge in demand as everyone turned on their lights at once caused power failures in some areas. And many people had grown so accustomed to the darkness that they found the new brightness hard to bear. They complained of headaches and found it difficult to sleep in rooms that were now filled with the light from the street outside. The end of the blackout marked a profound turning point. It was the moment when the war on the home front truly ended. It was a return to a normality that many people had almost forgotten, but it also revealed how deeply the experience of the blackout had been ingrained in people's consciousness. The return of light was a joyous occasion, but it was also a reminder of the strange, dark world that they were leaving behind. They had to learn to live in the light again, just as they had once had to learn to live in the dark. It was the final and perhaps strangest rule of the blackout, the rule of how to forget it. What psychological after effects of the blackout have never been fully studied? Did the generation of children raised in the blackout show a higher incidence of vision problems or sleep disorders later in life? We have anecdotal reports of unease, but was there a documented phenomenon of light anxiety, a form of agoraphobia among people who had spent years in enforced darkness? And how long did it take for the animal and plant life that had adapted to the dark urban environments to readjust to the sudden, permanent return of artificial light? Number 1, what was it like on September 1st, 1939? The very first rule of the blackout was simply to begin. On September 1st, 1939, 2 days before Britain officially declared war, the blackout was imposed. That evening, as the sun went down, an entire country was ordered to extinguish its lights for the first time. There was no gradual transition. It was sudden and absolute. What was that first night like? It was a night of organized chaos and widespread confusion. In the preceding weeks and months, the government had been issuing instructions and advice. People knew it was coming. They had been encouraged to buy blackout material and prepare their homes, but for many, the reality of it didn't hit home until that first night. There was a frantic last-minute rush. People were trying to tack up makeshift curtains, fumbling in the growing darkness. The shops had sold out of proper blackout cloth, so people were using blankets, dark paper, anything they could find. The authorities were out in force. ARP wardens, many of them new to their roles, patrolled the streets, trying to enforce rules that nobody had ever lived under before. The police were stopping cars to check that their headlights were properly masked. There was a sense of urgency and high drama. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. The darkness was not yet a routine. It was a shocking new reality. It was the first tangible sign for most ordinary people that their lives were about to change in a fundamental way. The writer Virginia Woolf recorded her experience of that first night in her diary. She described the strange, unnerving silence and the profound, ancient, and dark feeling of the countryside without any lights. For city dwellers, it was even more of a shock. The familiar, comforting glow of the city was gone, replaced by a disorienting and menacing blackness. People stumbled in the streets. Cars moved at a crawl. The world outside the front door had become a hostile and alien place overnight. That first night established the new reality. It was a dress rehearsal for the years of darkness that were to come. It revealed the scale of the challenge and the massive collective effort that would be required. It was a night of anxiety, of improvisation, and of a dawning realization of the seriousness of the situation. The simple shared act of turning off the lights was the moment when the war ceased to be a distant, political event and became a personal, physical reality for millions of people. The first rule was to obey, and on that night, a nation learned what obedience to the darkness truly meant. What are the most crucial, undiscovered details of that first, pivotal night? Are there official government or police reports from September 1st, 1939, still classified, that detail the true level of public resistance, confusion, or accidents that were deemed too demoralizing to release at the time? How many people, in a panic, made critical errors in blacking out their homes that night, and what were the immediate unrecorded consequences? And what was the secret reaction within the enemy's high command as their aerial reconnaissance reported back that one of the world's greatest cities had simply vanished from the map in a single evening?